Hello and welcome back to the Kent Morning Show, live on KMTV. It's just gone 7:45.
Now, this week marks the birthday of Ian Fleming, the creator of James Bond. And while 007 is a global icon, the roots that are connected to the character are very much here in Kent.
From Goldfinger to GoldenEye, Bond has long captured imaginations on screen and inspired generations of filmmakers and fans across the county.
Well, who better to unpack what Bond means to Kent and what makes the spy film so timeless, and of course it is Thursday, than Chris Deasy. Thank you very much for joining us here in the studio. James Bond, it's for you as a film fan, how high does it rank in terms of franchises that are out there?
Well, because of course we have the Mission Impossible, number 8 out at the moment. I was watching it again. I'm not going to tell you how many times. Well, okay, 7. And I was thinking,
Wow.
It is a Bond film, even down to the counting clock. You know, and in a way, this all started with Ian Fleming, who has a Kent connection. He lived not far from Dover at St Margaret's Bay. He actually passed away at the Kent and Canterbury Hospital just weeks before, literally I think it was like 5 weeks before, the 1964 Goldfinger was released. And there's a scene in that film which actually turns out it was filmed at the golf course in Buckinghamshire. But I think in the novel it's set in Sandwich. So there's a huge Kent connection all the way through this, with Moonraker as well, and the historic dockyard as well, which was used, this was after Ian Fleming's time, but Pierce Brosnan in The World Is Not Enough. So an incredible Kent connection with Ian Fleming, and iconic, because when you think that all these years on, so Dr. No was the first Bond film, 1962. And here we are now looking at all these spin-offs and who's going to be the next Bond. And of course now we can even look into the plurality, almost the multiverses of what is James Bond. Because it's not like, who is the next Bond? It's like, well, we might have an older Bond or a younger Bond. Pierce Brosnan, all these rumours that he might come back into the role. And you might have, like they did with Star Wars, all these extra instalments or prequels. So when the last Bond film ended, in case anybody hasn't seen it, but it sort of ended in an unusual way for a Bond film. You're thinking, how can they go from here? How can they continue this story? Because the character arc kind of ends. It's like, wow.
Yeah, and with such iconic franchises, there's also questions about keeping it traditional or diversifying as well. What's your take on James Bond diversifying?
Yeah, and that's such an important question. And I actually think that when the last film had, a female Bond, and also, a Bond who wasn't male, this is the interesting bit, and wasn't white. So all the sort of things that made the Bond films, which back in the days of Ian Fleming, there's no way the character would have been anything other than, George Lazenby or possibly Timothy Dalton, the ones who are perhaps closer to the source creation of James Bond. Sean Connery or Roger Moore were not the James Bond of the original novels. But, with all the quips and the one-liners and so on, that was sort of added through the Roger Moore incarnation. But because they're going to have all these spin-offs now, I suspect that they will be able to play with some of those varieties and indeed have a more diverse James Bond, and they can get away with it because it's not like whoever has the role will be doing it for 10 years. They can say, you can have maybe even a female Bond. And it doesn't have to be a British Bond. George Lazenby is Australian, but they've all been British up to now. So I think whatever goes on from this point, I think is going to be really exciting and very different.
And how's that received by true die-hard James Bond fans?
Yeah, and that's the question, because the reaction to any idea that James Bond could be anything other than a white man, I think is almost like, well, that goes against the spirit of the book. But I mean, I take a different line, which is that, well, why not? We've had lots of film franchises with female action leads, but it's more like Doctor Who, I think, was when we had the first female Doctor Who, that suddenly made it possible, like, but why didn't this happen earlier? What was the fuss all about? So I think that there are creative possibilities, but having numerous Bonds in different franchises means that they can try some, and the purists, the diehards, may not be quite so offended because there's the kernel will still be in place.
Is there an argument to be had that this is they're actors, they're playing a role, they're characters? We know this doesn't reflect the real world. Films that are action, that are thrillers, So is that sort of, does that argument have much weight to it?
Yeah, and this is, I always thought this, even like watching Doctor Who, when it was famously, it was Tom Baker at the end of the 70s when he gave, or early 80s when he gave up the role. And of course he'd be interviewed on programmes like this, but back in the like Nationwide, where it was almost like assuming that he was the role, or interviewing Christopher Reeve when he was Superman. And it was almost the sort of, what's it like to don the cape? And he's thinking, well, I'm an actor, this is the role that I played. I'm not actually the Superman, but perhaps the audience, want that. And so the fusion between the character and the star is one that has always been there.
Well, this is the problem that Daniel Craig has had,
Yes.
and will always have for his career. He will be James Bond,
Yes.
no matter what. If he takes on these Knives Out roles, becomes what's the
the Knives Out franchise. Yes.
He's the detective in that, isn't he? And that as much as he wants to put on this Southern American accent, people will still see him as James Bond. And I think there is something to be said about if we are going to diversify, if we are going to take this character of James Bond and maybe shave away what people traditionally consider the role to be, what that this sort of suave ladies' man. If you're going to flip that on its head, then you have to sort of realise, well, what is it that you're getting out of James Bond? Those fans who like it for the character will maybe go, well, this isn't for me. And those, as you say, they're just looking for an action film. They'll maybe still buy into it.
But perhaps you turn on a whole different kind of audience who are finally seeing some representation that reflects them on screen as well in these big, big roles.
Yeah, and I thought they actually handled it really well in No Time to Die by having 007, who wasn't Daniel Craig, who wasn't a white man. And suddenly it just showed that it's not that difficult, it's not unimaginable that you can have two James Bonds or two 007s in the same film, because 007 might be killed off and then the new, there's a successor to that role. So in a way, that there is an innate flexibility. And I always thought, when No Time to Die ended and they said, James Bond will return, I always thought, well, it doesn't have to be set in the current day. They can have a prequel. So I think that all of these options are now on the table. But now that we have the diversifying of the whole James Bond phenomenon after the sell-off of the Broccoli family are no longer there, they don't have sole creative control. You're looking at this and thinking that they can do all of this. If something doesn't work, it doesn't matter. They can try it out, and there'll be some that are destined for the big screen, some for the small screen. We'll have mini-part series, and probably former James Bonds, like maybe even Timothy Dalton, they might appear. They might be invited back. Pierce Brosnan, I can imagine, to sort of maybe have an intergenerational Bond, or maybe voices from the past, or so on. So I think this is actually a really exciting step forward.
They've got to strike the balance though. If they're going to be going and expanding this franchise almost like a Marvel approach to it, that they don't want to oversaturate it, because audiences can get a bit sort of freaked out by that.
Yeah, and that's the key thing, because the thing about Bond is that it actually has, up until now, retained the original approach, which is to have a single Bond who does the role for 4, 5, 6 films. Timothy Dalton did 2, George Lazenby did 1, but Sean Connery and Roger Moore did 6 or 7. So and the same with Daniel Craig. So there's the sort of expectation that they do this job for a while, but now that doesn't have to be the case. But whereas the Marvel films thrive on having the multiverses and the films which almost like liaise with all the other films in the franchise, Bond has been monolithic. And it goes back to Ian Fleming. It's amazing how they've retained that sort of approach since 1962. I mean, the first novel Casino Royale was published in 1952. So we're talking here of, Bond has been around for well over 70 years.
And talking about how these big names evolve as well, you mentioned at the beginning there, and Bartholomew shot me a look of disbelief, you've watched the new Mission Impossible film 7 times, did you say?
Yeah, I saw it the 7th time last night.
So what's different from the first to the 7th?
Wow. Yeah. Now, I thought this because I'm somebody, when one of my daughters saw that, she only saw it once, and she said, yeah, I got that completely. And she said, but Daddy, why do you need to see it so many times when the film, so she got things on the first viewing that it took me a few to get. When I watch a film, it's like the vibe. I'm reviewing the vibe of a film. It's almost like I don't always get the plot. I used to struggle with James Bond films because they're so intricate. The Mission Impossible films are the same. There's a level of intricacy and detail, but it's like the difference between the journey and the destination. When I'm watching a film, it's the process, it's the getting there, it's feeling the character arcs. It's almost like sometimes the clues that you miss first time. You mentioned Knives Out a moment ago. That's the same sort of thing. Those sort of films necessitate repeat viewing sometimes, so you can sort of piece it all together. I almost feel like watching a Mission Impossible film is almost the best analogy I could use, and the same applies to Bond as well, is like mindfulness. As you're watching it, it's washing over you, and you're sort of thinking, okay, I know what's happening, but because there's so many levels of intricacy there, you don't always remember the order in which it all plays out. They're very clever films. The Bond films, I think the reason they're so successful, famously, they always used to be shown on ITV Bank Holiday Mondays. It was always seemed to be the man with the golden gun when I was growing up as well. And that's why you can watch them again and again. You think, oh, Bond is quite misogynistic, or you might think Bond is more, he's more sort of emotionally adept or sensitive towards women, or he's quite, a more, a stiff and kind of restrained sort of figure. And every time I watch a Bond film, I get all these different nuances, and I watch it through a different lens.
So what's one film you would never watch again?
Well, you mean of the sort of Mission Impossible or Bond or any film?
Ever.
Do you know? I'll be honest. I saw The Phoenician Scheme last week, which is a Wes Anderson film. And if you like Wes Anderson, it's a different world entirely to Bond. It's great, but it's the sort of film, in watching it, I think I'm glad I saw it, but it's unlikely that I would go back to watch something like that because it has a different sort of vibe, and it's a very sort of off-key, very skew sort of world. Some people really love Wes Anderson films, but I enjoy a film where I kind of feel that each time I watch it, I get a different sort of take or perspective.
And of course, just quickly before we go, we were talking about James Bond. We couldn't not mention that you have a certain likeness to a certain James Bond, Timothy Dalton. If we got the picture, we can get it up.
Oh, that
here's yourself with Timothy Dalton. Have you?
I'm the one on the left, by the way.
You?
I'm the one on the left. Yeah.
Have you had this mentioned to you in the past?
I have. And what happened many years ago? I put a picture of me on Facebook, and somebody actually thought that it was Timothy Dalton.
Wow.
And somebody said, "How do you put your bow tie on?"
Change your Facebook name. There you go.
Good stuff.
All right, good stuff, Chris. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
All right.
Break.
See you in a minute.